it's an honor to be here. I'm a very proud Indigenous person. I'm a very proud Regina citizen, Saskatchewan citizen, and Canadian citizen. And when I get asked to come and speak, especially in my own Treaty 4 territory in Regina, it really brings me really good feelings. I'm 41 years old. I look young to some of you. It's that reserve water I shower in. I live on Cowessess. I live on Cowessess, is an hour and a half east of Regina, and I have 3 beautiful young children, my wife and I, and they're 3, 5, and 7. So so I have a young family. I didn't run for chief again in April. I was chief for 2 terms. I absolutely love my journey as chief. And before that, I lived in Regina for a decade. And then before that, I grew up on Cowessess First Nation. I was born in 1982. I am not a residential school living witness. At my kitchen table, both my parents are residential school living witnesses. I'm the youngest of 9 children, but my mom and dad met later in life. So I'm the only child from my mom and dad. I have all half brothers and sisters. So growing up in my house, you used to hear this, "Honey, your kid and my kid are beating up our kid." I was our kid. At my kitchen table growing up, my first ever experience I remember about the difference between being Indigenous and Canadian was when I was 8 years old. There was something in this country called Oka that was happening in 1990. And I remember sitting at the kitchen table and I would hear my dad get angry. Like, white person this and stuff like that. Then I'd see my mom look really worried. And so finally I asked my dad, I was like, "Well, Dad, why don't we just go talk to them?" And he's like, "Oh my boy, you have lots to learn in this world. You don't do that." And I was like, okay. I just kind of took it and I got lots to learn in this world. I started to get a little older. And my first ever experience of I encountering intergenerational trauma at my kitchen table in my own personal journey was this game called Duck the Police. My parents used to play this game called Duck the Police with me. And we'd cruise to Broadview, that's our local town. And my dad, mom, and I, and my dad would be like, "My boy, lay down, the police are coming," and I'd hit the floor in the car. Not knowing why, I just did it because my dad told me. And the cruiser would fly by, and my dad would be like, "Okay, you can lift your head up." So I'd lift my head up again, and I'd get to town. My dad would go in the store, and I'd be in the car with my mom, and my mom would be like, "My baby, lay down, the police cruiser is coming," and I'd hit the floor again. Not knowing why, I just did it because my mom told me to. By the time I was a teenager, every time I seen a police officer, my heart would start beating really fast. I couldn't look at them. I didn't want to be around them. I didn't trust them. I was so uncomfortable. And I couldn't figure out why until I realized when I got older in my journey, my own personal journey, that it was this game called Duck the Police. When I realized at my own personal kitchen table that this was intergenerational trauma, I told my mom and dad this. And they both kind of laughed about it. So this is why that is a personal journey and my healing journey. I'll start off with my father. My father was born in 1948 in this country. In 1951, some of you in this room may remember this, or it's your parents or grandparents. Something changed in our relationship with Indigenous people and Canadians in 1951. Indigenous people were able to leave the reserve and function like a regular Canadian. So many Canadians at that time were able to have an Indigenous person in the grocery store with them, which was not normal. Many Canadians had an Indigenous person live down the street from them, which was not normal because Indigenous had to stay on the reserve before 1951. So my dad moved to Calgary to be a steel worker, a very successful steel worker, just like many of you in the room and our parents and grandparents at that time. When my dad was on the streets of Calgary, he always had to fight to remain Indigenous because at the time the tension was kind of high because Indigenous people weren't normally walking down the streets in Calgary. And who would get thrown in jail all the time? Was my dad. So my dad never forgave the police for that. My mother, born in 1949, in 1955, my mom's great-grandma, my mom's grandma, my great-grandma, didn't want my mom to go to Birtle Residential School. So she kept her home. Who came and picked up my mom was the RCMP and took her to the train, which then took her to Birtle. My mom never forgave the police for that. So here I was born in 1982, a total different generation in our country. My mom was raising me thinking that an enforcement officer will tell me where to go to school, or my father was raising me thinking that just because I'm this beautiful caramel colored skin, that I'd have to fight to remain Indigenous. And when I realized this, I told my mom and dad this. I was like, did you know that game Duck the Police is our own personal intergenerational trauma? And when I explained this to them, they both kind of laughed. And today, when my mom and my boy Kingsley and I go to Broadview, my mom will tell Kingsley, duck the police. I tell my mom, we're healing, we don't play that. I share that with you because today in this country, we all inherited our history together. Nobody in this room created a residential school. Nobody in this country created a residential school. But as Canadians and Indigenous people, we all inherited this together. And when you inherit something, we have a responsibility to do something about it. Everybody in this room, in this city, in this province and country, we're all at a different stage in our healing journey. You know, when I started to get older, I eventually graduated high school on Cowessess Community Education Center in 2000. I had one goal at that time. There was this singer called Eminem, Marshall Mathers. I tried to look like him in grade 12. That was my big goals at the time. It wasn't a great goal. I'm just throwing it out there. But I eventually made my way off the reserve and I moved to Regina. And then I eventually made it to First Nations University of Canada. I really wasn't big into university or school at the time, but I was told and raised by people like Susan and others that education got us into this moment and education is going to get us out of this moment. And so I eventually made my way to First Nations University of Canada. I didn't really know what program I wanted to get into, so I just started in Faculty of Arts and undeclared. And one of the classes I took was Indigenous Studies. I was sitting with the academic advisor and I was like, they have a class called Indigenous Studies? I was like, I could probably teach this class, I said. See, I'm a generation Y in this country. We didn't have Indigenous Studies in our education program. We had social studies. And so I took it. And so I got into class, I got the syllabus, the orientation, the teacher did all this. And then she started to tell us about residential schools. That was my first ever time in my history I ever heard what a residential school was. As an Indigenous person, we can't just assume that Indigenous people know our history as well. Every one of us right now on this journey of reconciliation, we're all rediscovering the history together. I grew up at a kitchen table where all my parents and brothers and sisters attended a residential school. Nobody ever talked about it at my kitchen table. I grew up on Cowessess that housed a residential school. From 1898 to 1996, they didn't teach us that in school because it was still going on when I was there. But I never stayed there. When I got to university, I was so floored. I got angry. I got frustrated. I was like, what do you mean Canada treated Indigenous people like this? What do you mean my mom and dad and all my family had to go through this? You know, when I got home and I asked my mom and dad, I went home that weekend and I was like, Dad, what happened in Maryville? Mom, what happened in Birtle? And they both like stopped what they were doing. And they were like, why are you asking us this question? And I was like, well, what happened? I'm learning about it. And this is what my dad told me. Anything that happened to me there, it would not help you in this country. That's why I never told you. We raised you to be a dreamer in this country. And I was like, but what happened? And my relationship changed with my parents that day. I started to realize all the patterns of sacrifices that they made to put me in that moment. And I eventually made my way through university. I got an undergraduate degree in business administration from the First Nations University of Canada. And I loved that university. It awoke in this Indigenous spirit within me. And today, I utilize that in the best way that I can. What the beautifulness about being in Regina, in Saskatchewan, in Canada right now, as Indigenous people and Canadians, we have two worldviews that we all live in right now. Every one of us in this room live in a Canadian Western worldview, and it's beautiful. You know, every one of us under Section 91 of the the Constitution gives the federal government the Bank Act of Canada, so every one of us could have assets in this country. Vehicles, homes, and other things. It'll never get taken away from us, unless we miss our payments, of course, but you know, that's the beautifulness of living in a developed country. You know, Section 92 of our Constitution gives the provincial governments the accreditation to give us our certificates, our diplomas, our degrees, our masters, our PhDs. These are things that'll never get taken away. That's what makes Canada a developed country. And it's beautiful. Every one of us thrive in it. But there's also an Indigenous worldview here as well. We have two worldviews that we live in. Pre-1867, before Canada got here, before the British North American Act got here, there was a beautiful Indigenous worldview here. There was an education system, there was an economic system, there was a child welfare system, there was no children in care, no unemployment, everybody had a duty. It was a beautiful system. From 1867 to 2024, that Indigenous worldview is still here. But now today as Canadians, it's now up to us to welcome that Indigenous worldview into our lives. That's the beautifulness about being Canadian, is we can live in two worldviews. And that's what reconciliation is. When I got my undergraduate degree, I knew Indigenous worldview very well, but I didn't know the Western worldview very well. So I got my master's at a school called the Johnson Shiama School of Public Policy, and I got my master's there. And it's all in Western Canadian worldview. Then I became a chief. After I knew both worldviews, I ran to be a chief. At the time, I was 33 years old, and I started to campaign, and chiefs weren't normally that young. And I got elected at the age of 34 as chief of Cowessess in 2016. And I was chief for 7 years, and I absolutely love being a chief. There's one thing I learned today when I work with chiefs, because I have the utmost respect for chiefs because of what they have to endure. Being a chief in this province, 75% of our time is managing poverty. Psychological, physical, financial, mental poverty. 25% is innovation and economics. And so there's a real tough go for elected First Nation leaders and Métis leaders, and I give it up to them. I learned that being a chief. And so I stopped being chief in April 2023. I just needed to take a break. I got a gray hair for every month as a chief. They're tucked in here somewhere. But for the next half an hour, I want to take us on a journey. I want to take us on a journey on why we have to do this. I feel in a room like this, we're already understanding why, and we're focused on the how. So I plan to make sure that I give us a good action on the how as well. But the thing that we got to understand is reconciliation today has a ceiling. Everybody promises reconciliation in this country since 2015 until it starts to affect our personal lives, our political lives, our economic lives, then that's our ceiling. Everybody has a ceiling on reconciliation of some sort. And that ceiling, we have to identify it. I'm not saying we have to remove it, because I can't tell you to remove it. It's up to you as individuals, but I'm just here to highlight it. And that's not a bad thing. When we talk about truth and reconciliation, truth comes from the brain and reconciliation comes from the heart. Truth has to be wired between our brain and within our brain, because that's where our theory comes. Every one of us in this room was wired to this moment, to this hour, on what we understand as truth. Once we understand truth comes from the brain and how we wired it to this moment, reconciliation comes with so much more understanding and optimism. Reconciliation can only happen with an uncomfortable conversation. So we just got to understand that we're about to have an uncomfortable conversation. And Susan did let me know that there are support if somebody is triggered by these conversations. Because we just got to understand everybody is at a different healing journey right now and where we are at. One of the great things about First Nations University of Canada is we have an elders office. Indigenous worldview, we place our senior citizens at a VIP level. In Western Canadian worldview, we place our philanthropists, our politicians in VIP places. Indigenous worldview, we don't value monetary as VIP, we value knowledge as VIP. And that's why our senior citizens have seen 3, 4, 5 generations living on this land with us. So we put them in those, we call them knowledge keepers, elders, and so forth. And that's why it's really important that schools and organizations and such as yours have an elder's knowledge, because that's an Indigenous worldview value. And at First Nations University of Canada, there was this elder, her name was Velma. I was sitting with her one day when I was a student, and she told me the following: Cadmus, you got to show people your heart before you ask for their hand. And when she said that, I shook her hand and I walked away, and I had no clue what Velma just told me. I was like, that's rich elder knowledge. I didn't really understand it. Today I know exactly what Velma was telling me. You know, today in the Western Canadian worldview, we all want results. We all want tangible results. That's what kind of fuels us. Reconciliation, we ain't going to see tangible results all the time. Reconciliation is delayed gratification. All of our hard work that we're putting in right now, we may not see it, but I guarantee you our kids and grandkids will. And one of the things Velma was trying to share that I pass forward today is every day as Canadians, we wake up in the morning, and after our morning ritual, we turn on some kind of work environment, if it's a volunteer or actual work, and we're 2 hours behind right away. The emails and the calls and then everything added on during the day, we just can't catch up. And we turn it off at night, and we do it in the morning, and we're 2 hours behind again. Indigenous worldview is no different. We're just as fast-paced. But something that Velma wanted to teach us is, let's just not ask for each other's hand all day long, telling people what to do, people telling you what to do. Let's show them our heart. Tell them a little story about yourself. Show that spirit of who you are. Once you show people your heart, you'd be amazed at the shield they would put down and how much more collaboration you could do together. That's an Indigenous worldview that every one of us as Canadians could use in our everyday life. I'll give you an example of showing you my heart. I'll tell you, I want to show you my heart. I'll tell you a story. When Prince Charles, well now King Charles, when King Charles came to Saskatchewan in 2012, it was 2012, they asked me if I would tour him and Camilla for 25 minutes, just me and them, a First Nations University of Canada. And I was like, oh my gosh, this is such an honor. And so I read his biography. He likes architecture, he likes gardens and so forth. And so I was getting all up to date on gardens and the building and the architect. And then I met the Secret Service. And the Secret Service says you can't touch him, you can't tell him what to do, you can only address him as Your Royal Highness. I'm like, he's a human, right? And so I got all my tour ready, and there was thousands of people at FNUC that day, all behind the gate, and there were just King Charles, Queen Camilla, and myself walking with others, and I was touring them and all this and doing my duty. But I found a joke. I was like, I want to tell him a joke. This guy probably doesn't laugh that much. So I found this joke. So I'm touring him, and I'm just being as good as I can on our behalf. And finally, I told him, Your Royal Highness, on behalf of all my people, I just want to tell you, we like what you done with the place. He looked at me, and then he looked away, and he looked at me again, and he started laughing. I was like, Your Royal Highness, I just wanted to make you laugh. I told him. His mom sent me a Diamond Jubilee a year later, so I must have did good in his team. And on the other side, I told my mom, I was like, Mom, I get to meet Camilla, and my mom's a huge Princess Di fan. You kick her in the butt for me. Mom, I'm not going to kick her in the butt for you. Now that you've seen my heart, and I like to storytell and laugh and make you laugh, I'm going to ask for your hand. That's an example of showing a heart and then asking for hand. I'm going to ask for your hand now, and let's take this journey for 25 minutes. I'm going to take us on a journey of truth, and I'm going to bring it into actions on how we can do things together better. One of the things about truth is, what did we know to this moment about truth? Sometimes, as Canadians, we move too fast to reconciliation. We want actions, but we don't spend enough time on truth. We move to reconciliation, thinking we know the truth. And then we start to get confused, we start to get frustrated, our wheels start to spin, and then we just kind of shelf it and say, I'm not sure where to go from here. There's a reason why we hit those moments in truth and reconciliation. It's because we don't spend enough time on the truth. So I just want to make sure that when I leave today, that we can understand the foundation of how important truth is. Then we move to reconciliation and all of the great things you're doing. Like when I got here, I was lost for about 5 minutes, and then I was found. But I got to read so many beautiful things in your building. Like I could have stayed here I could have been lost for another 15 minutes. I was just so amazed. And I can tell the action is wanted in a room like this. But I just want to make sure that my little time with you is that we can understand truth. And so I want to start coming at it from a Canadian perspective. There's a reason why, as Canadians, we get so uncomfortable to understand the truth. It's because our brains weren't wired correctly to understand the truth. And this is what I mean. Our education system in this country is our driver of hope. Meaning that everything our kids take in school right now, our hope is that they'll have a better life than we do in this country. It's our driver of hope. But what did our education system do to put us in this moment? And I want to start off with the baby boomer generation. The baby boomer generation in this country asked one thing of us, to look after them, and we're going to do our best. But when the baby boomer generation was in our Canadian education system, in elementary or junior high school, what were they taught about the truth from our Canadian education system? The reality is they were taught nothing. The ones that went to a religious school at the time were taught the opposite, that residential schools are saving the Indian. The things baby boomers learned as little kids about the truth was from Hollywood movies. The buckskin wearing, the paint on the face, living in teepees, the war calls, the game Cowboys and Indians. I pre-warn you now, if we play Cowboys and Indians after and I'm playing, the Indians usually win. I'm just throwing it out there. But that's what the baby boomers learned. It was far from the truth. Generation X, the biggest decision generation in the city and province and country right now is Generation X. They've earned their roles from patience, perseverance, and training to make it to these decision-making tables. But what did Generation X learn in our education system when they were elementary and junior high school? This is what Generation X learned in our education system. In 1969, the federal government proposed a white paper, which was the Indian solution to the Indian problem. This was the attitude of that. Indians, get over it. Put you on act special in this country. Move off the reserve. Give up your rights. Just be a Canadian. If anybody thinks that's the solution, you're wasting your energy. That will never happen. But that's what Generation X learned in our education system. Far from the truth. Generation Y. I'm a Generation Y. I went to a reserve school. It was no different at the time. What did we learn in our education system in this country? This is what we learned. Yeah, Indians, you signed treaties, but you agreed to surrender the land. Somehow the Indian Act in residential school was a part of the truth. Far from the truth. Generation Y was not taught the truth as well. Today our millennials have taken a Native studies, they're taking Indigenous studies, they're getting it. Today, our Generation Z exiting high school, they're taking a Native studies, they're about to take Indigenous studies, they're getting it. This is what we just inherited. There's no mandatory Indigenous studies class coming to baby boomers X or Y. We're the students right now in this moment of truth and reconciliation. Our teachers are our kids and grandkids. The most important table to talk reconciliation today is the kitchen table our kids go to in this province. Right now, our kids are going to their kitchen tables and saying, Grandpa, you know what I'm learning in school about treaties? Sometimes Grandpa's going to debate grandson. But that's the reason why truth is so foundational. In Indigenous worldview, the greatest warrior is the one that brings peace. In Western Canadian worldview, the greatest warrior is the one that's on the horse with a six-pack and is going into a buffalo raid. That's not a warrior from an Indigenous worldview. Indigenous worldview is the greatest warrior is the one that brings peace. When we talk about truth and reconciliation, we have to bring it from the greatest warrior is the one that brings peace. We don't debate people who do not know the truth. We educate people who do not know the truth. And that's why we're in this moment of truth and reconciliation. The other side for Canadians is when a new Canadian gets to our country. Our country needs new Canadians to sustain our economics for generations to come. And we're a dreamer country internationally, so we're going to get a lot of new Canadians. But when a new Canadian gets to this country, what orientation are they given to explain the truth between Indigenous people and Canadians? This is what a new Canadian is given. Do not go downtown after dark time. New Canadians find their history from their fellow new Canadian family, friends, and family. And sometimes those teachers don't know the truth. Like, this is what we inherited today. Remember, we didn't create this moment, we inherited it. But one thing we can control is how we wire the truth to understand. The other side of truth is what happened to Indigenous people. What is intergenerational trauma? What happened in residential schools? The way that I explain it is from my maternal lineage And that's our family, because I'm related through Cowessess. My maternal lineage. My great-great-grandma, her English name was Gracie Lewison. She was born in 1882. Gracie was born east of Regina, and she was pure. Gracie had strong vertical lineage. She had affirmation of love, physical touch, quality time, the gift to serve. Gracie had 7 generations of emotional intelligence and beautiful Indigenous worldview taught to her from her mom and aunties, her grandma, and so forth. It was beautiful. Gracie was beautiful. Gracie had my great-grandma, Maggie. Maggie was born in 1900. Are you going to be all right? I can stop if you want. You're going to be all right.
They're our neighbors.
I know, and that's why I just want to make sure. Okay, I can stop if you want. You're good? Okay. I just want to make sure Phyllis is all right. This is our family. I'll talk. It's a really good story. I just know it's true. Maggie was born in 1900. Maggie should have got that same beautiful vertical lineage teachings as Gracie. But Maggie didn't because of a Canadian policy called residential school. Maggie had to go into horizontal survival mode with her sisters and cousins. And you know, that history we're learning was real in that ugliness that we all hear of. You know, so Maggie wasn't able to get that beautiful vertical lineage teaching. Maggie had Evelyn, my grandma. Evelyn should have got beautiful vertical lineage teachings from her 7 generations of beautiful Indigenous worldview. But Evelyn didn't. Evelyn had to go into horizontal survival mode with her sisters and cousins. Evelyn had my mom, Charlotte. Charlotte was born in 1949. When this government was good justice and fairness for all, not Charlotte. Because of a Canadian policy, Charlotte had to go into horizontal survival mode with her sisters and cousins. Today, I was born in 1982. When this country didn't believe in my mom raised me to still believe in this country. You know, today I'm very honored to share with you that I got a 7-year-old daughter. Her name's Callie, and her and my mom are inseparable. Their vertical lineage has gotten stronger. Right now in this room, in this city, in this province and country, every Indigenous person, all we want is our vertical lineage back. Some of us, we're there, and we praise and thank, and we want to learn more. Some of us, 45-degree angle is getting stronger. Let's keep up the social impact, the education impact, the economic impact. Some of us in 2024, 100% horizontal survival mode still. Remember, we inherited this moment. Indigenous people, we don't want pity. We don't want anybody to feel sorry for us. We want parity like every other Canadian, while our Indigenous worldview isn't tested anymore. Like, that's truth. Once you understand truth, reconciliation can happen with so much more understanding and optimism. And reconciliation is taking this moment that we're in right now and just looking around us and saying, how do we make sure we get to that end goal? Because the end goal is simple. Indigenous people want parity, just like every other Canadian, while our Indigenous worldview isn't tested anymore. Nobody disagrees with that end goal. But we're going to disagree on how to get there. It's human nature. That's just who we are. So we got to just understand that we have to have uncomfortable conversations on how to get there. And it's rooms like this. You know, when I walked in and, Dawn is such an advocate on the foundation and framework that Indigenous people are rights holders, and that's where this doctrine comes in. Like, he's in rooms like this every week talking like this. And that's the thing is we just got to understand we have to have a lot of conversations to understand it. But what is reconciliation? Reconciliation is a means to an end. Reconciliation is going from colonized to decolonized. When I was a chief, I stood up in a band meeting and I told Cowessess people, We gotta decolonize ourselves. I thought I was gonna get a standing ovation, and one of the elders stood up and said, Chief, don't use those $10 university words around here. I'm like, how do I explain decolonization? This is what we mean by decolonization. My great-great-grandma Gracie, she was pure. She had affirmation of love, physical touch, quality time, the gift to serve. She had a strong vertical lineage taught to her from 7 generations. Today, her great-great-great-granddaughter, my daughter Callie, should walk this same land as her great-great-great-grandma with that same affirmation of love and beautiful vertical lineage. Decolonization doesn't mean that Indigenous people want to move back to 1882 times. No, we love living in 2024. We love the things that this country offers. Decolonization doesn't mean Callie and I are going to move back to 1882 times and go to the hunting society for our food the way my great-great-grandma Gracie did. No, Callie and I do our hunting at Costco today. As Indigenous people, decolonization means that Callie, my daughter, can live that same beautiful life that Gracie did. But now Callie can also be a pilot. She can go to school. She can gain assets when she gets older, just like a Canadian. That's what Indigenous people want today, that's decolonization. And how do we know when we get there? You know, there's a story that I like to share about Chief Cowessess. You know, one of the things in this province is First Nation reserves are named after the last male hereditary chief that agreed to Treaty 4. Chief Pipot was a male figure. Chief Quakatus, Chief Cowessess, Chief Kakawishtaw. These were male figures that touched the pen and agreed to treaty or adhesion to treaty. Chief Cowessess was a senior citizen in 1874. He was an elder in 1874. Chief Cowessess watched half of his family perish in 1860 from a smallpox pandemic, a Western disease his Indigenous medicine couldn't keep up to. Chief Cowessess watched the buffalo deplete to nothing in 1870. The only thing he was taught on his maternal and paternal side was the buffalo to sustain his people. It food, health, housed, shelter, medicine, clothing. The buffalo was everything, depleted to nothing. Chief Cowessess watched new Canadians get to this land, new settlers in 1873. He knew change was coming, but he didn't know what this change meant. At the agreement of treaty in Fort Qu'Appelle, Chief Cowessess was under this tent, and he was watching all the Crown relations work for Alexander Morris. He was the commissioner on behalf of Queen Victoria. And everybody kept going to this one person. They would walk up and ask this person a question and then walk away. So finally, Chief Cowessess asked the interpreter, because he only spoke Saulteaux and Cree. He asked the interpreter, who's that person? Why do they keep going to him? And this interpreter said, that's a lawyer. And Chief Cowessess asked, what's a lawyer? And the interpreter said, he went to a school. He was taught to read books. Today he protects and enhances the laws in this country. And Chief Cowessess said the following, if I agree to this treaty, can you help my children be like him, but always make sure they remain like me? The interpreter went and talked to Alexander Morris. Alexander Morris came. Because of the language barrier, they couldn't speak to each other. The interpreter was vital. Alexander Morris confirmed to Chief Cowessess that if you agree to this treaty, we'll help your children be like that lawyer, but always make sure they'll remain like you. Chief Cowessess touched the pen in anticipation and hope of our future together at that time. Picture 2 canoes going down a river. I don't want to teach us the wampum treaty of my cousins to the east. That's a beautiful teaching. But picture 2 canoes going down the river. This is what Chief Cowessess envisioned. One canoe is that Indigenous worldview. The other canoe is the Canadian Western worldview. We were supposed to flow down this river together. As long as the sun shines, grass grows, river flows. Every generation we were supposed to exchange a child in each other's canoe and raise those children to know that ideology and then give them back. We were always supposed to change our social and economic mandates together. Unfortunately, that didn't happen. After treaty, the Indian Act was thrown in the Cowessess canoe. The Indian Act had one purpose: to imprison the minds of anybody who thought Indigenous worldview. That our governance structure didn't matter anymore. Our Women's Council didn't matter anymore. The Indian agent will come and tell you that the government will be the parent and Indians, you're now the children. That canoe fell behind a little bit. After that, the residential school was thrown in the Indigenous worldview canoe. The residential school had one purpose: to brainwash anybody who thinks Indigenous worldview, our language, who we pray to, our vertical lineage. And that canoe fell behind even more. Today in 2024, we're just trying to catch up. We're not asking Canadians to slow down and wait for us. We like the progress. We're not trying to take a different river. We're not telling Canada to go back to Europe. At least I'm not. Some people in my canoe say that. I'm like, that's never happened. We're just trying to catch up. That's reconciliation. When you're in that Indigenous worldview canoe, put 2 feet in there, because you belong in that worldview as well as Canadians. When you're in that canoe, just remember, Indigenous people, it's not that we lack talent. We have the talent, but sometimes we lack the resources to lift us to those talented places. And that's something we just all inherited together. When you're in that canoe, it's so beautiful. As Indigenous people, humor is foundation to us. We're going to laugh with you. We're going to tease with you. If you get a nickname in that canoe, that means you're really light. I just want to warn you. 80% of the time, it's a good nickname. 20% it kind of be kakash a little bit. In that Indigenous worldview canoe, we have all the healing mechanisms. That's why sometimes Canadian Western worldview canoe, they have too much solutions to help all of our issues. Sometimes as Canadians, we just have to pause and say, listen, I'm not going to go in there with a solution. I'm going to go in there and just open my mind, be radically open-minded, and relearn as a Canadian. And it's not all beautiful. I'm going to be real with you. As Indigenous people, we have faced so much in generations. We've kind of became our own worst enemy to each other at times. But don't take it personal. We're on our own healing journey, in our own kinships, in our own communities, in our own Indigenous ways. Right now, as Indigenous people, we have our own unwritten truth and reconciliation we're trying to deal with. Because there's 2 truth and reconciliations in this country. There's a 94 calls to action, which is all of our responsibility. But there's a second one that's not written. It's Indigenous to Indigenous truth and reconciliation. We're trying to figure out right now. Don't compare Kakawishtahow to Cowessess, Cowessess to Paipot, Paipot to Whitecap, Whitecap to Cowessess. We're all on a different healing journey right now. And one of the last things about the Indigenous worldview is you cannot do reconciliation until really seeing it from an Indigenous worldview lens as well. And that's really important. I'm going to start to close, and I hope there's a little conversation. But how do we know when we get to reconciliation? How do we know when we fully get to that end goal? Because it's going to be beautiful. In this country, we are going to have the strongest social and economic impact when we get there. But remember, it's delayed gratification. It's one day at a time. The end goal is very simple. When we fully implement reconciliation, there's going to be 2 relationships between Indigenous people and Canadians. One of them is going to be economics. And that's why I started a few companies today, because I want to help out with that economics. I find in economics, when kids wake up and watch their parents get ready for work, You can change so much in a home fire in one generation. I'm a huge believer of that. And so one of the relationships is economics. The other relationship is quasi-jurisdictional. The more that we start to share our health jurisdictions together, our child welfare jurisdictions together, as you've seen Cowessess do in the last few years, our social, our education, our economics, that's when we're going to really see reconciliation. Unfortunately, we all have to leave that to the politics to do it, and sometimes politicians can only make it worse rather than better. I'm not here to get partisan with you, but I'm just saying that sometimes our biggest hindrances is we just got to be a little bold at times. You know, it's not a party thing, it's not a political thing, it's not a federal, provincial, municipal thing. But if we don't unlock and start to talk about those parts too, then it's going to be really tough. Because I'm going to be real with you, it's actually going to get a little worse before it gets better. What happened in James Smith a year ago, Cree Nation, can technically happen in almost any First Nation in this province right now. As Indigenous people, the unmarked graves, the pandemic, the Buffy Sainte Marie conversation has triggered us in ways that we can't even control our own selves right now. And so in that Indigenous worldview canoe, remember, that's not your fight, but that's you to be a breath of fresh air to us when we're finding our foundation. And you know, to just understand that, that's how we're going to align. So I'll end off with this. You know, how do we know when we get there? I have a 7-year-old daughter, her name's Callie. And Callie is she's grade 2 right now. And during the pandemic, 3 years ago at the peak, we were on Cowessess, and Callie and I were playing outside. She was 4 at the time. And she said, "Dad, what's that in the sky?" There was a plane. I was like, "Oh my girl, that's a plane." She's like, "Dad, what's a plane?" Of course, when you tell a 4-year-old something, they're going to ask why 4 or 5 times. So I said, "Honey, it's like a bus." I said, "There's a pilot that she's driving it and someone's handing out peanuts down the She's like, "Dad, can I be a pilot one day?" I was like, "Oh my girl, you want to be a pilot?" I was like, "My mom and I will raise you to be a pilot." So my wife and I are raising a little grade 2 pilot right now. This is the reality of what we all inherited. The toughest person to be in this country today is an Indigenous female. And all you have to do is read the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls Calls to Justice, the 231, to just understand that. My wife and I have to try twice as hard in this country of anybody else raising a non-Indigenous grade 2. My wife and I accept the challenge. We are going to try twice as hard, and we are going to raise a little pilot. But this is the reality of why reconciliation is so important. If Callie ever has a daughter, I sure hope Callie doesn't have to try twice as hard to raise her little girl. That's why reconciliation is so important to every one of us. The moment we realize that we just inherited this moment, the more we put into it, and remember, it's delayed gratification. We may not see the results, but I guarantee you one day our kids will tell us, "Thank you for all those bold moves, those bold decisions to assure that we got it right this time. Now we can really implement those hard decisions today." That's why we're all here today. Thank you very much for letting me share.